Did that help? There we go. Okay. So, good morning, and welcome to our annual celebration of Palm Sunday, the Lord's triumphal entry into Jerusalem, initiating his week of the Passion Week, right? And what a transition the week will bring for Christ's life in that year. And we are, however, looking back at the Old Testament, and one of the most predictive portions of the Old Testament regarding Messiah Jesus. So just to make a few historical comments relative to this day in the church calendar of our celebration, does anybody recall, you don't have to guess, I'm just curious if you would know this, the most common title that Jesus liked to refer to himself as? Yes, excellent. Son of Man. That's Daniel. That's a specific reference to the Messiah. The Messiah's title in Daniel is the Son of Man. That's an important element of Daniel's prophecy. The dating of the book of Daniel and the second portion of the book of Daniel when we get there, which will probably be in the fall actually, but when we get there, and I really mean that, that's kind of the plan, because I can't teach all summer, the entire summer. But the dating of Israel's final years of history, the last 490 years of Israel's history are prophesied in the book of Daniel. There's a pause between the 483rd 3 years and the last 7 in the book of Daniel. That's not explained in the book of Daniel. It's kind of odd until we find that God is making room for the church age later on. But many have gone back and tried to calculate, and it's difficult to do, not knowing exactly the dating sometimes. But Daniel has a lot of good time markers. I've talked about the importance of paying attention to time markers when we study. And Sir Robert Anderson, a famous scholar and mathematician of the late 19th century, of the 19th century, 18th and 19th centuries, calculated, and many have replicated and said he's probably accurate here, that the 483 years ends when Jesus walks into Jerusalem on Palm Sunday, on what we recall as Palm Sunday. So Daniel has some significant ties to what we celebrate in the life of Christ every year, and even this day. But we're not there yet. So let's go back to Daniel chapter 2. And the encouraging part in this section is that I'm right on track, actually, with my lesson. What a deal. This is exactly what I planned to do. So, wow, what a deal. Okay, and this one I actually got it right. In Daniel chapter 2, we read last time through verse 35, and we covered, almost right where I wanted to be last week, just within a few verses. And we concluded in Daniel chapter 2 and verses 10 through 12. I especially want to pay attention to verses 10 and 11 again. And what we were saying was that this passage reveals the inadequacy of the king's advisors. It reveals the inadequacy of them in 2 ways. And I emphasized one last time, but I mentioned the other just as we were closing, so I just want to go back to it. It emphasizes their inadequacy spiritually in 2 ways. One, their own spiritual resources. These were men who acknowledged that they were relying on spiritual resources to do these things. When we looked at what these titles mean, we recognized that in almost all cases, and even in the least likely case, the Chaldeans, that specific category, right, of Chaldeans, which are probably military political advisors, even they were tightly connected, believing that their victory in politics and on the battlefield depended upon the victory of their God over their enemies' gods. right? So all of these individuals, and that's the least connected to clear spiritual resources, and all of these declared that they were relying on spiritual resources, and those spiritual resources failed them, right? The king's test pulled back down the curtain and showed the foolishness of the human inadequacy behind there. But it also then revealed spiritually the inadequacy of their theology. So let's review verses 10 and 11 again. This is after the king for a second time reiterates that they have to tell him both the dream and the interpretation. The Chaldeans answered the king and said, "There is not a man on earth who could declare the matter for the king." And so far they are true, if one relies on human ability. "Inasmuch as no great king or ruler has ever asked anything like this of a magician, conjurer, or Chaldean. Moreover, the thing which the king demands is difficult, and there is no one else who could declare it to the king except the gods, or gods, who, and here's their theology, whose dwelling place is not with mortal flesh." Really? So what they're saying, as we noted, is that this decree from the king is something that is not humanly possible. It is not something, it is something that is unprecedented. So it's impossible, verse 10 beginning, end of verse 10, it's unprecedented. No king's ever asked this. And verse 11, it's unnatural because it requires the supernatural. Right? So they're inadequate, and their resources are exposed, both in terms of their connection to their gods, and their theology turns out to be wrong. And by the way, we're going to come back to that. I said this is the key theological question. Does God dwell among men? That's the key question. And I argued that actually this is exactly what these Jewish guys knew to be true, because God had revealed himself in Israel that he would make his dwelling among them. Not because they had, God in a box like sometimes they thought they did, right? But because God chose to set his name in Jerusalem, and he would dwell there among them, among his people. And ultimately, what we know through the Messiah who is announced in Daniel is that God is going to dwell not just among us, but in us. That God does dwell with mortal flesh, when mortal flesh is in right relationship to God. But mortal flesh hasn't been in right relationship to God since the garden, and cannot be except through God's provision, right? All right, so at this point then, the decree is carried out. Because of this, the king became indignant, very furious, as if he wasn't already. And he gave orders to destroy the wise men of Babylon. So the decree went forth that the wise men should be slain, and they looked for Daniel and his friends to kill them. So it's striking to me that the consequences of this spiritual inadequacy, this failure, is that it reaches way beyond the individuals who were standing before the king. We noted last week that Daniel and his friends, and probably the others who are still in schooling at this time, this is the second year or the third year of their schooling. So they're not graduated yet, and they're not allowed to come into the presence of the king. So they haven't been given an opportunity, and yet this spiritual inadequacy, this failure of theology, is going to cost people their lives. And not just the people who failed. It's going to spread beyond that. So the consequences are great. And here we see that Daniel's apparent previous interactions with authorities gave him a short window of opportunity to appeal. So, would you join me as I read the rest of this passage again from last week? Verse 14. Then Daniel replied with discretion and discernment to Arioch, the captain of the king's bodyguard, who had gone forth to slay the wise men of Babylon. He answered and said to Arioch, the king's commander, "For what reason is the decree from the king so urgent?" Then Arioch informed Daniel about the matter. So Daniel went in and requested of the king that he would give him time in order that he might declare the interpretation to the king. Then Daniel went to his house and informed his friends Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah about the matter, in order that they might request compassion from the God of heaven concerning this mystery, so that Daniel and his friends might not be destroyed with the rest of the wise men of Babylon. Then the mystery was revealed to Daniel in a night vision. Then Daniel blessed the God of heaven. Daniel answered and said, "Let the name of God be blessed forever and ever, for wisdom and power belong to him. And it is he who changes the times and the epochs. He removes kings and establishes kings. He gives wisdom to wise men and knowledge to men of understanding. It is he who reveals the profound and hidden things. He knows what is in the darkness, and the light dwells with him. To thee, O God of my fathers, I give thanks and praise. For thou hast given me wisdom and power, and now thou hast made known to me what we requested of thee. For thou hast made known to us the king's matter." Therefore Daniel went in to Arioch, whom the king had appointed to destroy the wise men of Babylon. He went in and spoke to him as follows: "Do not destroy the wise men of Babylon. Take me to the king's presence, and I will declare the interpretation to the king." Then Arioch hurriedly brought Daniel into the king's presence and spoke to him as follows: "I have found a man among the exiles from Judah who can make the interpretation known to the king." The king answered and said to Daniel, whose name was Belteshazzar, "Are you able to make known to me the dream which I have seen and its interpretation?" Daniel answered before the king and said, "As for the mystery about which the king has inquired, neither wise men, conjurers, magicians, nor diviners are able to declare it to the king. However, there is a God in heaven who reveals mysteries, and he has made known to the king, Nebuchadnezzar, what will take place in the latter days. This was your dream and the visions in your mind while you were on your bed." And I'll stop there for right now. I never get enough of reading these passages. Every time I read the book of Daniel, I'm reminded why I think of it as, if not my favorite book in the Old Testament, it is close. I mean, it is certainly among top. And that's hard to do when you talk about God's word, right? I mean, it's all good. But my goodness, what an amazing thing. Let's back up and finish this last section about how the dream was concealed, basically, which we're looking at down through verse 16, right? The concealing of the dream. And what we find in verses 12 and 13, first of all, that the consequences are reiterated. And the consequences are a mass destruction of the entire class of advisors, all of the different versions of the advisors. And in verses 14 to 16, we see again Daniel's prudent request. And I think it's important that we note it as a request, right? This is an urgent command from the king, and the consequences are mass destruction of all of the class of individuals that Daniel has found himself assigned to in Babylon. And his response is a request, which is pretty amazing to me, really. I think my first response might have been, fight or flight, run, hide, fight off. I don't know, but I'm not sure that request, other than pleading for my life, which probably wasn't going to help much right there, and he did not. His request was not to plead for his life, because that probably wasn't going to help, right? Arioch knows he's under command from Nebuchadnezzar, and either he follows the command or his life is in danger, because the king is furious about this. It's been stated multiple times, and he keeps getting angrier. You keep getting more intensive, emotive language being used, all the way up to verse 10, right? So Arioch is on it. He's going to do this. Also, I think it's noteworthy that the request would probably not only have failed because it was the wrong request, but even given the right request that he makes, it probably would have failed if he didn't have a previous relationship with this person or with the authorities around which Arioch functioned, right? So Arioch already has contact and knowledge of Daniel and his three friends, apparently. And I think that that's important too. I think that cultivating relationships as believers in God is a part of what God wants us to do. He wants us to restore relationships, and he wants us to represent him. Thus, we must cultivate relationships. And Daniel had done his homework, more than just for school. He had done his homework in preparing the ground about the people he's working with. So if you would forgive me just a moment of application to slide into, for which we do periodically, and I think is necessary, but with whom has God given you an opportunity to cultivate a relationship? Authorities, especially, right? Believers ought to be people who know how to respond to authority. This is something that evidently is a clear mark of faith. I'm always struck by the Roman centurion who came to Christ about his dying child. And when the Lord Jesus said, okay, I'll go with you, and he said, no, I'm not worthy, right? He immediately explained a chain of authority. He was appealing, Daniel's appealing, he was appealing to someone that remarkably by faith, this Roman centurion counted as his superior. The rabbi, Jesus, whom he has already acknowledged, apparently, through his words and his works, to be the Messiah of Israel. I mean, that seems to be the case, because he's acknowledging that God is with him in a way that God is not with anybody else he could go to. And he immediately states that he understands authority. Right? No, I too am, and interestingly, not in authority, I'm under authority. And I say to this one, go, and he goes. That power is not the ultimate source of movement in human experience, but true authority is. You have to have the right of the power, right? So Daniel acknowledges authority here. And he has cultivated a relationship with that authority, apparently, because when he asks and replies with discretion and discernment, Scripture says, to Arioch, he asks, this is his question: for what reason is the decree from the king so urgent? That's so wise, right? He's not saying, no, don't do it. That would be like, sorry, this is going to happen. He's saying, well, did the king give an absolute word about the timing here? Why is it so urgent? Which engages a conversation with someone he's already cultivated a relationship with and offers an option. So prudent, but also confident, because you don't make the statement that Daniel makes, or the offer that Daniel makes, without being very confident about the God you serve, right? Daniel inquires about the time factor, and then he requests time on condition that the dream would indeed be revealed and interpreted. He says to Arioch, Arioch informed him about the matter. So Daniel then goes in and he requests time of the king that he would give him in order that he might declare the interpretation. So the request for time is coupled with a promise he will declare the interpretation. So it's both prudent and it is confident. I'm also kind of struck by the reactions of the authorities in both levels, right? First of all, Arioch. Arioch lets him go to the king. Again, I don't think there's a good way to explain that unless Daniel has cultivated a relationship here of trust. I think there's also a sense of desperation that this reveals. If you are Arioch, the commander of the king's bodyguards, and you have been for many years working around either Nebuchadnezzar or perhaps Nabopolassar, his father, right? You know the importance of the advisor class in the king's court. And this is probably very disturbing to the commander of the king's bodyguard. That the king is going to destroy all of these people who are his closest trusted advisors. And what does that say for my position and security? Right? I mean, where does that put me? And what's going to happen when the king doesn't have all these great advisors and the only people around close to him are the people who are protecting him, like me, perhaps? And I realize I'm doing a little sanctified imagination here, but I'm trying to put myself into the roles of these narrative individuals and say, what happens to me when all these advisors are gone and the king is struggling to know what to do, and he looks at me and asks me what I'm supposed to do. You know, I think my head's on the block next. I mean, those two things are the two things that naturally come to me to say, why would Arioch allow Daniel to go to the king at this point? I think A, Arioch has a relationship with Daniel, and B, he is uncomfortable with the situation too and thinks this might be an option out. What are some other things you might have thought of? George?
Yeah, chapter 1, right? Arioch may not have been the prince of the eunuchs, but he no doubtedly knew about the situation as described in chapter 1.
Absolutely.
And so Daniel has credibility here.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely.
That's what I mean by cultivating the relationship. He has credibility. Go ahead, Alan.
I know that you had mentioned the motivation behind Nebuchadnezzar's move to do this is that loyalty test aspect. I wonder if some of it's just he's flying off the table. And maybe Arioch's going, we need cooler heads to prevail here. Let's see if we can't rein it in. Because it is interesting that in spite of this command, Nebuchadnezzar, why should you listen to Daniel's plea? You know, Daniel's is no different than these guys. Give us time and we'll give you the interpretation. It's the exact same plea.
Yeah, except that
One in time, and also what the dream was. And he doesn't claim that, which is nice. The other Alan.
It's a question that I always ask. How is it that he could even go and ask the king?
Yeah.
Because I think of Esther.
Right.
And you couldn't. You had, and even at that, she had to go to someone who went and requested.
Right.
How is it possible that he was able to do that?
Yeah,
That's a really good question, and there are a couple of things that, of course, the scripture, it moves quickly. I'm always struck by between the verses, it moves quickly without explaining, right? I'm struck, for example, what you're pointing out, that it doesn't specifically say this time that Arioch brings him to the king. It just says that he went to the king. He asked Arioch for permission to, he asked Arioch really not even full permission. He just says, why is it so urgent? And then Arioch informed about the matter. So Daniel went in and requested of the king. It's like, how did we get there so quickly? So one thing is that although the ancient world all seems to be the same, Esther's kingdom is a different kingdom, right? So Esther is living in the later Persian kingdom, and there are different rules of court. So you can't translate everything back into the Neo-Babylonian kingdom. I do, again, think that chapter 1 helps explain this, that Daniel has some credibility, as George said earlier. I don't know that because there's an absence of information that we can't just infer, as later happens when Daniel gets the vision and answers what the dream is and what it meant. I don't think it would be wrong to infer that just as Arioch brought him before the king the second time, he had a role in letting him go before the king the first time. Otherwise, he couldn't have gotten there. Arioch's role was to go destroy them. But the difference is that on the first time, Arioch doesn't want to put his head on the line to see how the king will respond, whether or not to allow Daniel time. So Arioch's, did I say Ariel? Arioch's, sorry, listen to what I mean, not what I say. What's the other line my dad used to say? My tongue got in front of my eye teeth and I couldn't see what I was saying. That's weird. Anyway, Arioch, I think, wanted to stay out of the first connection so as not to have culpability. But the second time, he wants to take credit for what's happening. So he is more involved. But either way, he had to allow it. That's a good question. George, you had a thought.
It just struck me, and the Bible's not written like a screenplay, right? The Bible's not trying to pull out every detail of what's happening. We read this chapter, and it might cover, even if it just describes one interaction,
yes,
it could be a multiple page
Exactly.
description. So the Bible's just pulling out what's most important. So think about Esther. The fact that her life was on the line was important to the story because she was a Jew.
right.
Here, the life's already on the line, so the details about how to get to the king don't matter.
Doesn't matter as much, probably. That's probably true. Yes, Andrew.
I was going to say, I think part of the reason Nebuchadnezzar may have been so willing to accept such an unusual request was he's probably not stupid, and he's thinking, well, if I lose all these guys, I'm left with nothing. So if any of them if there's any chance that any of them could actually be legit and I get some info out of them, fine, I'll take it.
Yeah, so the idea,
That he has really lost it in terms emotionally, as Alan mentioned. It could be that he's had a few moments to cool, right? And he's realizing the consequences of his rash anger. It also, I think, as I get there, I'm gonna mention this. I was gonna mention, but I'll say it now. Is that I think it speaks to his desperation. He has not ceased to be deeply troubled about this dream, and he is in the midst. It's easy to see all the crisis of the advisors in their failure and inadequacy, and the consequences for Daniel and his friends. But the king is in his own crisis, and that has not ceased. He is absolutely desperate, right? So, Daniel, I think, reveals that the king must have been very disturbed about the dream to overcome his anger, even if he'd had a little time to chill. So I think that this section also, just to go back as we've mentioned, just remember this section helps explain why the king finds Daniel and his 3 friends 10 times better, because this is during their training. So at the end of the training, which we read about at the end of chapter 1, everything is in chapter 2, that's a part of his analysis, right? So that's part of the deal. Okay, so what we see now for the rest of these verses, down to verse 35, is the dream revealed. So immediately, Daniel leaves the presence of the king, having been granted time in order to make known the dream and the interpretation. And where does he do? He goes straight to the house of his friends and informs them about the matter, in order that, just to make this clear, why would he do that? Just not because he's gossiping about the latest wild stuff that's going on in Babylon, but verse 18, in order that they might request compassion from the God of heaven concerning this mystery, so that Daniel and his friends might not be destroyed along with the rest of the wise men of Babylon. So the dream is revealed in this section between verses 16 or 17 and 35. First, by Daniel and his friends before the Lord. So we see Daniel and his friends first before the Lord. And the sequence here down through verse 24, first of all in verses 17 and 18, which we just looked at, he seeks prayer support. He sought assistance, and he let them share in the rewards later as well as in the need. So throughout this passage, we over and over again are going to come back to the fact we see Daniel's humility, right? He's appealing. We're going to come back to that idea too. As a matter of fact, I think I'll just take a moment there to talk about the appeal. Just this idea of appeal, it requires, first of all, that we correctly identify legitimate authorities in our life, right? You don't know who to appeal to if you don't know who the legitimate authorities are. And some people you don't appeal to because they're not legitimate authorities. Who are the valid authorities in your life? We have to be able to do that. That takes wisdom. And secondly, we have to learn to appeal rather than demand, which causes us to trust God more. When we demand, we're really trusting ourselves. Because a demand always comes with an or else, right? Demands, by definition, are always or else. Or else what? Or else I'll. It's all about me. But a request places myself into the hands of a legitimate authority, an appeal, and ultimately acknowledges and trusts that God will work through my authorities. It takes a great deal of faith. So when I say that Daniel has wisdom and faith, it's specifically revealed through the actions that he takes. And I think that's something we need to do too. So, prayer support. He sought the assistance of these guys. He didn't take it on himself. He is humble. Right? Throughout the passage, he's humble. He doesn't think he can do it alone. It's not all about him. Secondly, he finds an answer from God. The mystery, verse 19, was revealed to Daniel in a night vision. It's, I think, in Hebrew, the shortest sentence in the chapter. I'm not a great at Hebrew, but it looks like that to me. Okay? It's the shortest sentence in the chapter. All of this hullabaloo, the entire chapter's confusion, the crisis for King Nebuchadnezzar, the threatened destruction of all the wise men and their panic at not being asked to do something so impossible. The drama of Daniel going in and seeking more time. The drama and the amazement, the awe of the revealing of Gentile history through this dream of the king. The whole thing hinges on God telling Daniel what is the dream and what it means. And the entire portion of the chapter that deals with that, in terms of the actual process where Daniel gets the information from God, is the shortest sentence in the chapter, which is, then the mystery was revealed to Daniel in a night vision. Does that strike you? I mean, knowledge is granted directly from God like it was no effort at all. I mean, I write in my notes next to this, wow, that was easy. What's the big fuss? I.e., go back to the theology of the advisors and contrast it with the theology in the rest of the chapter. It's impossible. No man could reveal this. True, unless he has the right spiritual resources. You don't. Because the gods don't dwell with man. Well, true, because the gods are false and at best demons. But God does, if you're in right relationship with him. And then it's easy. Because God knows. He is a God of knowledge. The next thing, and I tell you these time markers, then the mystery was revealed to Daniel, then, the end of verse 19, Daniel blessed the God of heaven. Immediately, with knowledge, he turns not to his friends to rejoice. Guess what I know? Although he's going to do that next. He doesn't turn immediately to Arioch. He doesn't run to Nebuchadnezzar immediately. He turns to God, as if he's got all the time in the world. He requests time of the king, but who does he really think he has time from? God, because he's got time to praise.
There's humility there, because Daniel, he's confident that God can do that. I don't know that he knows that God will choose to give that to him, right?
No, he does. I don't think you do until you get it from
Right.
God.
You can't-
Anything
You
from
can't
God.
demand stuff from God. right?
Exactly.
There's humility about completely submitting myself to whatever decision God says.
Yeah.
And what he does, he worships. Verses 20 through 23. Some amazing worship. Prayerful worship. Daniel answered and said, let the name of God, Elohim, be blessed forever and ever. For why? For wisdom and power belong to him. Both are true, which is real authority. You have both wisdom and power. You got the authority, right? And it is he who changes the times and the epochs. He knows that this is about history and who controls history ultimately. God is sovereign. He removes kings, establishes kings. He knows, because he knows what the vision is now. He gives wisdom to wise men and knowledge to men of understanding, directly contradicting what the wise men said in verse 11 to the king. It is he who reveals profound and hidden things. He has all of that. He knows what is in the darkness, and the light dwells with him. God can't go anywhere in darkness because he is the light. The light dwells with him. To thee, O God of my fathers, the one true God. Notice he identifies him, not just some generic great God of the universe, right? This is the God of Israel. To thee, O God of my fathers, I give thanks and praise. Humility, for thou hast given me wisdom and power. He is not taking responsibility for himself. Even now thou hast made known to me what, and look at this. Look at the pronouns. Everything up to this point has been me. This, because I was the one who received the vision. So you've done this for me. You are the great God. Now he turns it not only to acknowledge God, but to acknowledge others. That's real humility. You know, there are people who can acknowledge God in a way that makes them feel small and humble, but they don't acknowledge others. They still think of themselves as, among others, pretty tops. But Daniel says, even now thou hast made known to me what we requested of thee. For thou hast made known to us the king's matter. He is including Daniel, Hananiah, and Mishael. He is seeing what other people are doing and contributing to his life. I had a hand over here. Alan.
Kind of jumping off something James said, I think it's interesting, the four kind of main big stories that we know from James, Daniel 1 through 6, the testing with the food at the beginning, this event here, the fiery furnace, the lion's den, all four of those are times where Daniel or his friends are not promised directly from God that I will pull you from this, I will make it so that you look better, I will reveal, it's all, we're trusting that God will do this, and if not,
They do not know the outcome for them personally, but what they trust is the God who has control of the outcome, and that God will ultimately do what is glorifying to Him, and they're committed to that.
I think they said that directly in the first story.
In the first story, it's fantastic.
They literally say, he'll save us, but if he decides not to, it doesn't matter.
That's right.
And that's why I say it's one of the greatest statements of faith in the Bible, actually. And it's very instructive. So here we have the answer from God that seems easy, the worship of God. And I again just want to say, compare Daniel's theology in verses 20 through 23 with the theology of these other advisors in verses 10 and 11. And it is amazing, the difference. Finally, he expresses concern for others. Verse 24, therefore, the next thing Daniel does, therefore Daniel went into Arioch, whom the king had appointed to destroy the wise men of Babylon. He didn't go straight to the king. He went to Arioch first. He went and spoke to him as follows, take me to the king fast. No, do not destroy the wise men of Babylon first, then take me to the king. And by the way, take me to into the king's presence, and I will declare the interpretation of the king. I don't know how he got to the king in the first case, but this time he made sure Arioch came with him. And I find pleasure and instructiveness in that. I don't think he trusted Arioch not to carry out the task. Okay, I got to go talk to the king. Why don't you come with me, right? I want you with me. Because you're the one who's supposed to go kill all the wise men, and I'm telling you, don't kill the wise men, and why don't you come along so I can keep an eye on you. Maybe that's not what he was thinking, but I kind of feel like he was making sure the wise men were going to be safe while he was going to talk to the king. Because this might take a while with the king, and I don't want you to get nervous and carry out your orders. I know there's a little sanctified imagination there, but I like that detail revealed in the text. Daniel shows concern for others. Wisdom and knowledge grant a great deal of power, and Daniel now had a great deal of power, right? The old saying that we've learned since the Industrial Revolution, knowledge is power, right? He had a great deal of power. But that power should be used with compassion for the benefit of others, not just self, or not just our friends. These are people who are pagans. Why didn't he just let Arioch kill the rest of the advisors? Daniel, Hananiah, and Mishael and Azariah will take over, and they'll be the good guys. Why don't we just let him kill them? Because God cares about people, even the lost. I might argue especially the lost. Right? And his people have compassion on the people God has compassion on. Even people who don't deserve it, like me. So Daniel is identifying with people that we as readers probably don't want to identify him with. He accepted his identification with these false pagan advisors, and he has compassion on them. Again, I think there's a lot of instructiveness in that, in how we should reveal God to a lost world. Now we see Daniel before the king in verses 25 to 30. So Arioch hurriedly brought Daniel in before the presence of the king and spoke to him as follows, I have found a man among the exiles from Judah who can make known the interpretation to the king. Daniel comes not to take jealous credit, sort of like Arioch does. But by contrast, verse 26, the king answered and said to Daniel, whose name was Belteshazzar, are you able to make known to me the dream which I have seen and its interpretation? Daniel answered before the king and said, no, I'm not. Isn't that what he said? I mean, he didn't say those words. He's wiser than that. He might not have gotten anything else out if he'd said no, right? But he said no, because he said, as for the mystery about which the king inquired, neither wise men, conjurers, magicians, diviners are able to declare it to the king. And the king probably would have thought of him as one of them, right? However, there is a God in heaven who reveals mysteries. Daniel, again, humbly, not jealous of credit, nor of that of the other advisors, not jealous of the other advisors. He gives credit to God. Lehman Strauss, one of the commentators I've mentioned a few times, says, too frequently some of us miss opportunities like this to glorify God. We discover some truth in the Bible that no one has previously brought to our attention, and then we go about preaching it as though we wrote it. That's instructive for those of us who teach the Word especially. And yet he's really confident. There is a God in heaven who reveals these mysteries. And he has revealed it to the king. And he is insightful. As for you, O king, while you were on your bed, your thoughts turned to what would take place in the future. And he who reveals mysteries has made known to you what will take place. I'm telling you, the insight of what God reveals through his word, when he reveals his word, is more than just facts. Do you see that what Daniel is saying is he knew the content of the dream and its meaning, but he also knew Nebuchadnezzar's experience that night. Did you catch that detail? Before the dream came to you, before you fell asleep, you laid on your bed that night and your thoughts turned to what would happen in the future, and then you fell asleep. Wait a second. He knows what was going on in Nebuchadnezzar's head before he had the dream, too. This is, again, a lot of credibility. God is building credibility. He has such insight. God reveals not just content, but he reveals experience. And finally, the dream is described, and we will go through it carefully next week. But this week, we will, or not next week, 2 weeks from now, Lord willing, unless we're in his presence, in which, like I always say, he'll take over the instruction from there. But the dream is revealed here, and in a couple of weeks, we'll look at it more carefully. But the revelation is a miracle of God's knowledge. I forgot to change the thing the whole time. Have you been doing it for me? You are so kind. Thank you. Wow, what a good guy. Okay, I'm just going to let you keep doing that. So, the revelation, right? God, a miracle of God's knowledge and intervention is what God has done, and Daniel gives credit for it. And then we see the image, right? In verses 32 and 33. The head of the statue was made of fine gold, its breast and arms of silver, its belly and thighs of bronze, its legs of iron, its feet partly of iron and partly of clay. So this is the description of the image itself. And by the way, this, you can go to the next slide, thank you. This is, and it might have looked something like this. Its possible form would have been in the form of a Babylonian a warrior or maybe a kingly style, and this is based on both linguistic and archaeological evidence that it would have looked something like this. The distinctive dress of a warrior king in the Babylonian structure, from what we see from reliefs and things like that, seems likely, especially because of the detail of putting the belly and the thighs together. Even in this depiction, it's probably not quite right that the midsection would have gone lower toward the knees in archaeological evidence. So the reason it's described as the belly and the thighs is because the belly and the thighs would have been covered by a distinctive type of dress appearance that a Babylonian warrior king would have worn. It would have gone from the belly down to most of the thighs. So that's why it's all in one section. That suggests to you what this image looks like, okay? And it makes sense that if the king is going to have a royal vision, it's probably going to look like royalty, right? So it makes sense. Later, he's going to build a statue, and it kind of looks like this. So we're, it seems like everything is fitting together. I just want to make a few observations about the statue itself right now, just material, right? First of all, it moves, the description moves from the head to the feet, which is significant. It doesn't move from the feet to the head. Kind of interesting. Moves from the head to the feet. The description, secondly, goes from unity to division in some ways. So you move from one head to chest and arms to belly and thighs, then totally separate, right, the legs, and then feet, which have toes. I mean, it's being more distributed as it goes down. So it moves from unity to division. It also moves in materials from precious to most common, from gold to silver to bronze to iron mixed with clay, common clay or potter's clay. And so that's precious to common. It also moves from heavy to light. The mass of these things diminishes as you go down. Gold has greater mass than silver, has greater mass than bronze, has greater mass than iron. I don't know if mass is the right word. I don't want to stick to the science carefully. Density, thank you. Thank you. Maybe density is the right word. Yeah, I'm not a science guy. So whatever the right word is there. It moves from heavy to lighter, basically, as it goes down. Though one could argue that bronze and iron might not be very different. Okay? But they're certainly less, more common as you go. It also moves from soft to brittle, generally speaking. So the metals go from relatively soft metal. I have a gold wedding ring. It had really neat kind of crisscrossy, it has marks still in the middle, but it had like a crisscrossy texture to it when I got married 37 years ago. And now it's smooth except for those little cut marks in the middle, because gold is pretty soft, even though this is cheap gold. The better the gold, the softer it is. So it moves from soft to brittle. Clay is very brittle. And there is a general comment about this in verse 39, beyond our text. After you, there will rise another kingdom inferior to you, and then a third kingdom of bronze, etc., which rule over the earth. So they also move, general comment, from superior to inferior. The last thing is that Daniel reveals the action that takes place in the dream, right? And that, of course, is that this stone, which is cut from a great quarry or mountain, flies at it, cut without hands, flies at the statue, does not hit it in the head or in the chest, hits it in the feet. And then the entire thing collapses on itself in a very unnatural way. Can you imagine these materials grinding themselves down to such a powder that they could be blown away by the wind? You know how people get gold when they gold pan? It's because it doesn't move very easily, right? How do you blow this stuff away with the wind? Daniel's account is complete, precise, and concise. A stone cut from non-human source smashes the image at its feet, whence the entire image collapses on itself, is crushed to dust, the wind blows it away, and the stone remains, and it grows into a great mountain that fills the earth. God's plan revealed. Everything else that God reveals going forward in the book of Daniel is related to this chapter and this basic outline. It's worth noting. God's grace to you.